Send it. And then Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing both of us.
February 1966, the self-proclaimed president for life, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, was ousted in a military coup.
The overthrow of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. I had never seen such an explosion of joy.
We were in prison when we heard that Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. Come and see in the prison. People were weeping because of joy. The prison was full. As for people who died there, you cannot count them. But they were weeping when they heard Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown.
Okay, this video aims not just to be another story about the rise and the fall of Kwame Nkrumah, but rather to use Kwame Nkrumah and his leadership of Ghanaian independence as a case study from which to explore how decolonization and post-independence played out in Africa. And Kwame Nkrumah is an excellent case study from which to explore this theme and the challenges that African leaders faced after the colonial period during the post-independence period. In 1957, when Kwame Nkrumah led Ghana to independence, he was revered as one of the greatest leaders on the continent. He was seen as a role model and an inspiration for other African leaders. The idea that Africa is now going to assert itself on the international stage, is now going to be a leader rather than a pawn in international global relations. All of these individuals who had these hopes and these dreams, they looked up to someone like Kwame Nkrumah, and he was seen as such a great inspirational leader, a liberator of his people. But just 6 years later, in 1966, when the military coup overthrew Kwame Nkrumah's government, Ghanaians celebrated. At this stage, Kwame Nkrumah was seen as another example of the stereotypical African dictator who creates a one-party state, who bans opposition, and under whose leadership the country became increasingly corrupt and increasingly bankrupt. But why was this the case? And this is an important theme from which to explore, because it wasn't just unique to Kwame Nkrumah or to Ghana. This played out in other African countries as well. In fact, it's almost like a cliche or a stereotype. You have, during the colonial period, a heroic nationalist figure who leads his people to liberation, who overthrows the colonial government, who makes promises about ending poverty, ending hopelessness, bringing about dignity, bringing about prosperity for his people. But once the country becomes independent, this leader and his government ends up ruling the country just like how the colonizer ruled, banning opposition, exploitation. The masses continue to live in poverty. And why was this the case? And Kwame Nkrumah and his leadership in Ghana is, as I said earlier, an excellent case study from which to explore this. Now, before we actually get to Kwame Nkrumah and what happened in Ghana, it's just important to just point some important characteristics about this whole process and how it played out. During the colonial period, these colonies were not designed to be independent nation states. They were designed, during the colonial period, many different groups were put into one unit, which became a colony, and the colony was designed to supply the metropole with what the metropole required. So if Britain had Ghana, for example, which was called the Gold Coast provided Britain with a raw resource or a cash crop, in this instance, cocoa. And Ghana's economy was structured around that. But for individuals like Kwame Nkrumah, who are now going to lead what was once a colony and make it an independent nation state, this was not sufficient. For individuals like Kwame Nkrumah, how can a country function on the export of one commodity? What if there's a drop in the international price of that commodity? And he wanted to create a country that is self-sufficient. But this is a very, very challenging process. And there's a lot of dilemmas, there's a lot of contradictions in bringing about this goal. And in trying to do his long-term vision, Kwame Nkrumah had a long-term plan for Ghana. He didn't look at the short term. And this led to, once he came to power, him becoming increasingly less popular as time goes on. It's this dilemma that leads people like Kwame Nkrumah to say that democracy won't work in Africa. Because if you want to win the next election, which is 4 years' time, and if you're implementing policies that are going to benefit the country in 4 years' time, you're not looking at the biggest perspective. Kwame Nkrumah was looking at the long-term perspective. How does he make Ghana self-sufficient? How does he make it no longer dependent on importing manufactured goods? He wants to invest a lot of money in education, on healthcare, provide free healthcare, provide free education. And this is very, very expensive in the short term. It'll have long-term benefits, but it's going to cost a lot in the short term. But during this period of time, as Kwame Nkrumah his government is spending a lot of money on large projects, corruption creeps in, and they start overspending. Sometimes it's actually an opportunity, and there's a contradiction with Kwame Nkrumah. Because on one hand, Kwame Nkrumah is speaking about neo-colonialism. He speaks about the West lending African countries money and they then using this debt to tell African countries to impose conditions on them, tell them what to do. But at the same time, Kwame Nkrumah's critics are warning that he's the one who's enabling it to happen in Ghana. He has this big vision, his scientific socialism, where he's going to create this and he's going to do that, and it's very expensive. And he needs money, he needs to borrow money, he needs the United States to help him implement some of his projects. And by doing this, he further puts Ghana in more and more debt. But as he puts Ghana in more and more debt, he attracts more and more criticism. But for Kwame Nkrumah, he can't take this criticism because he's looking, from his perspective, he's looking at the long term. His critics are looking at the short term. He knows what to do right now. If people sit here and they argue and they say, no, we do this and we do that, progress is not going to be made. And that's his perspective. And he becomes more and more dictatorial, banning opposition, creating a one-party state. But also, there are assassination attempts on his life. He's very famous for passing the Preventive Detention Act, which gave him the ability to arrest someone without trial. But when there were that many assassination attempts on his life, he felt it necessary in order to pass laws such as that. So this is one of the challenges, because when the African leader becomes leader of an independent country, he doesn't inherit a functioning self-sufficient country. He inherits a former colony. And for Nkrumah, who wanted this former colony to become a leader, to become wealthy, to become I would say wealthy, but self-sufficient, no longer dependent on foreign powers for imports, it's a very challenging task. And it's a challenging task during a very hostile international Cold War climate. And all these challenges will influence the decision-making, the decisions in front of Kwame Nkrumah. And that, in a nutshell, is what we're going to explore in this video about Kwame Nkrumah. Now, the story of Ghana, and why another example of why it's a good case study from which to explore this theme, is that it was the first country south of the Sahara to gain its independence in Africa, the first sub-Saharan African country to gain its independence after the Second World War. But you can also see it as the first African country to fight for its independence and to get the colonizer out. And that's why Kwame Nkrumah is seen as, again, as the liberator of the continent. So in 1957, the Gold Coast, as it was called, but it would become known as Ghana, became the first African country south of the Sahara to get its independence. And why was this the case? All right, so what happened? So that's where we'll start with this in this video. Now, during the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt gave an agreement with Winston Churchill that after the Second World War, all countries would have the right to self-determination. The United Nations is founded after the war and put decolonization on the agenda. Colonialism compartmentalized Africa, and you can see the United States wanted Africa opened up. But also, there was also a lot of influence of the Second World War on Ghanaians themselves. During the war, Ghanaian soldiers, many of them fought in the East alongside the British. And there's a good documentary, and I will post a link in this video description, of a former Ghanaian soldier, Jeffrey Adewa, who said that when they went to India and they fought for the British war effort, they came into contact with Indian nationalists. And the Indian nationalists asked them, why are you fighting this war? And they said, we're fighting for our freedom. And then they said, what about your own freedom? Why don't you go home and fight for your own freedom? So in 1945, when the Second World War ended, there were a lot of factors which made it seem as if decolonization was going to be brought about. Now, Britain realizes, okay, times have changed. There's a lot of pressure on Britain to give up its empire. And it's in 1947, India gets its independence from Britain. The nationalist leaders lead India to independence. But now what about Africa? Africa was colonized more recently during the 1880s. And during the colonial period, there was no idea or talk about decolonization in Africa. So now Britain began to experiment. Okay, what are we going to do? Their most developed colony, the tropical colony in Africa, you can think that as being the Gold Coast, which would become Ghana. It stood out in comparison with other colonies. It was the wealthiest of British colonies. It was the leading producer of cocoa. It had the most advanced system of education compared to other colonies. It had the highest amount of educated elites. It also was reasonably homogeneous. The kind of ethnic divisions that characterized some of the other colonies were not found in Ghana. The Akhans were about 50% of the population. And another important characteristic about the Gold Coast was that there was no large white population. There were about 5,000 British settlers against 2 million Africans. Now, this is very important because when you look at countries that had a relatively smooth transition from colonialism to independence, like Ghana, like Nigeria, it was where there weren't a lot of white settlers. But if you look at countries which had a very violent transition from colonialism to independence, like Southern Rhodesia, which is today's Zimbabwe, like Angola, Portuguese Angola and Portuguese Mozambique, like British Kenya, like French Algeria, it was in instances where there were a lot of white settlers. So basically, in a nutshell, the Gold Coast had a lot of favorable characteristics for the British to experiment with giving Africans more representation and pathing a way to independence. There was a high number of educated elites. There was not a lot of ethnic tension. There were no white settlers who would be opposing to more representation for Africans in parliament, etc. So this is why the Gold Coast ended up becoming the place where the British are going to start experimenting. Now, before we get to that, who was Kwame Nkrumah? Now, Kwame Nkrumah was born on the 1st of September 1909. Well, his mother had his date of birth in 1912, but he later changed it to 1909. He was born in a small town, Crofel, a small village near the border with the Ivory Coast. His father was from the Ivory Coast. He was of a minority ethnic group called the Zimmer. His father was a goldsmith and his mother was a petty trader. He was raised mainly by his mother, and he was supposed to become a Catholic priest, but he started to earn money. He started studying and he started becoming a student teacher. At the age of 16, he was already teaching. While he was teaching, he impressed and became close with the deputy headmaster of a very influential school called Achimota College. And the deputy headmaster, James Agri, he began to inspire Kwame Nkrumah and influence Kwame Nkrumah. He was a pan-Africanist. He wanted to unite Africa. He was a follower of Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. And he introduced Kwame Nkrumah to these ideas, made Kwame Nkrumah more and more interested in pan-Africanism and an eventual long-term goal of liberating his people in the Gold Coast. He also came into contact with Nnamdi Azikiwe, who would later go on to lead Nigeria to independence and become the president of Nigeria. But Nnamdi Azikiwe had studied abroad. He had gone to the United States and studied at Lincoln University. And he told Kwame Nkrumah, if you have these goals or if you have this ambition about ending British rule in your country, it would probably benefit you if you do the same and you go to Lincoln University. It'll open your mind. It'll give you a lot of knowledge that you can then use to fight for independence. And Kwame Nkrumah decided to follow this advice. and he traveled to the United States. His marks were not high enough for him to get a scholarship. So during his time in the United States, he had to work multiple jobs. And two very important influences happened to him when he was in the United States of America. The one was he came into contact with, or he began to see, the poverty and the racism in the United States of America. The United States of America, this is before the Civil Rights Movement, and he began to see the conditions, supposed to be the most developed, advanced part of the world, supposed to be the leader in democracy, but he could see the inequality, the conditions in which a lot of African Americans lived. But he also this was an opportunity to get more and more familiar with the concept of pan-Africanism and to meet other revolutionaries like C.L.R. James and George Padmore, other influential pan-Africanists. Pan-Africanism is a movement that sought to the idea that why was Africa colonized? Why is Europeans able to colonize? Because Africans were divided. During this transatlantic slave trade, Africans would sell other Africans as slaves. Obviously, they didn't sell their own people, they sold the historical enemies. But the whole idea that Europeans were able to exploit that. During the colonial period, Europeans, when they went to wars with African armies, they often had African soldiers in their forces fighting other Africans. So the whole idea is that Africans need to unite. And because of divisions, it was easy for Europeans to exploit this. So these Pan-African ideas, a lot of Africans who were born in the diaspora, whether it was North or South America, were leaders in this whole concept of Pan-Africanism. And this began to influence Kwame Nkrumah when he was there. Okay, during this time, Kwame Nkrumah got a lot of experience. Apart from his degree in economics, philosophy, and sociology, he also got a lot of experience working in a soap factory as a ship steward. He sold fish on the streets of Harlem. He came into contact with a lot of African Americans who are Pan-Africanists. But another important thing that happened during his time in the United States that will benefit him later on when he's leading the Gold Coast to its independence is that during his time in the United States, he published his own newspaper called the African Interpreter. But in 1945, he decided to move to London. And when he moved to London in 1945, we must take into consideration what's going on. This is the year in which the Second World War had come to an end. But it's also the year in which the 5th Pan-African Conference took place in London. Now, even though this was the 5th Pan-African Conference, it was the first Pan-African Conference, which was dominated by Africans who were born on the continent themselves, like Kwame Nkrumah, like Jomo Kenyatta, amongst others. Prior to this, most of the Pan-African conferences were dominated by African Americans or Africans who were born in diaspora, whether North or South America. This was the first where Africans who were born on the continent were there, and hence there was a strong emphasis on decolonization at this time. Now, while Kwame Nkrumah is abroad, there's a lot of developments that are happening back in his home in the Gold Coast. Now, coming back to our story about why the British decided to experiment with the Gold Coast, because it was one of the best candidates to experiment with decolonization. In the post-Second World War climate, Britain decided to experiment with its most developed African colony, creating an African majority on the Legislative Council for the first time in 1946. And as a consequence of that, the following year, a number of individuals who would be known as men of property or standing, the elite class in the Gold Coast, would form an organization called the United Gold Coast Convention. And they established this in 1947 with Joseph Danquah as its president. Joseph Danquah was a lawyer, the typical type of leader that the British would like to be the next or the independent leader of Ghana, or it was called Gold Coast at that stage. In fact, it was Joseph Danquah who first came up with the idea of dropping the name Ghana and dropping the name Gold Coast and changing it to Ghana, because Gold Coast is what the Europeans called the region. He wanted an African name, and one of the confusing points today is that we will know about this ancient kingdom of Ghana that existed, and it actually didn't exist in the modern state of Ghana. It was in what is today Mauritania and Mali. But when the Gold Coast was about to get its independence, they wanted to change it, give it a more African name. So they chose the name, the historical Empire of Ghana, for the name of their country, which would eventually become independent. Now, since these members of the UGCC, or the United Gold Coast Conventions, were professional, Joseph Danquah was a lawyer, they were businessmen, their full time was dedicated to their careers. They needed an organizer, someone who could work on the organization full time. So the obvious candidate would be this person named Kwame Nkrumah. They would have read about in the newspapers the 5th Pan-African Conference, and this Kwame Nkrumah, a guy who was born in the Gold Coast, played an important role in this 5th Pan-African Conference. So it makes sense that they would invite him to come back and join the organization. Now, when the news reached Kwame Nkrumah, on one hand, he would be distrustful of people like the UGCC. He was more radical. He was a socialist. And he felt that this is like this group of Africans who are kind of, I don't want to say collaborators, but very influenced by European politics, not really representative of the masses. But on the other hand, Nkrumah's abroad, struggling to make ends meet. And what's the point of being abroad? Here's his opportunity to come back home, get a job, and try to lead his country to independence from his country. So he accepts and he comes. But immediately upon coming back to the Gold Coast, tensions start emerging between him and the other leaders of the UGCC. Now, even though the Gold Coast, by colonial standards, is one of the wealthiest, a British best tropical colony, it still has a lot of problems and economic challenges. And now, in the context of the post-Second World War period, whenever there's a war, it was always followed by a kind of depression. And the Gold Coast was experiencing many economic challenges. Post-war inflation led to poverty, and foreign shop owners were charging very high prices. Cocoa farmers were also unhappy with the way in which the British colonial authorities dealt with a disease infecting the crop. There was this disease that which was very contagious, and the colonial authorities perspective was to stop this disease from spreading. They had to destroy all the trees that had this disease. But the problem was, before the actual side effects manifest themselves in the tree is still producing healthy looking cocoa pods. And British colonial officials are coming and demanding that cocoa farmers destroy their crops. So this was creating frustration. Foreign shop owners, a lot of Syrians were charging very high prices, also adding to frustrations. And in addition to this, there were 63,000 ex-soldiers who had fought in the Second World War and were frustrated that the government was not doing enough to help them find jobs. Now, these soldiers were very frustrated because they had sacrificed, they had fought in World War II, they come back home, there's no jobs. They demand redress. Joseph Danquah and Kwame Nkrumah addressed the union on the 20th of February 1948, wanting to take a petition to the government. However, on the 28th of February, the soldiers, the ex-servicemen, marched on the governor of the Gold Coast headquarters in Christiansburg Castle, and the police ended up opening fire on them and killed a few. And when they killed some of these ex-soldiers, the country descended into rioting and chaos, and there was a lot of rioting, and the colonial authorities' solution was to throw the leaders of the UGCC, who are known as the Big Six now, into prison. They blamed them on the rioting. The subsequent imprisonment exposed tensions that were emerging between Kwame Nkrumah and the more conservative leadership. The moment Nkrumah joined the party, he was the one who was constantly promoting strikes, and it created a rift between him and Joseph Danquah, who preferred more conservative means. And a lot of tensions were emerging. And now, by the time that Nkrumah and the rest of the leaders were thrown into prison, these tensions began to get more and more visible. The leadership also blamed Kwame Nkrumah for the strike and their imprisonment. But after they were released from prison, Kwame Nkrumah began to consolidate his appeal to the masses and began to separate himself from the UGCC. He began to see whereas the UGCC are representing the elite group, he wanted to represent the masses. And after just 18 months of being in the UGCC, he eventually broke away and formed his Convention People's Party, or CPP. This was a response to a lot of support from him to break away from the UGCC that he had received. In contrast, the UGCC's slogan of self-government in the shortest possible time, the Convention People's Party had the concept of, or the slogan of self-government right now. And they felt that stalling is facilitating this idea of neo-colonialism. They were distrustful of these UGCC who want to work with British colonial structures. Why? Nkrumah would say, seek first your political kingdom and all else will follow. According to Kwame Nkrumah and his supporters, all the problems that the Gold Coast faced, all the poverty, is because they were ruled by foreigners. One of the economic challenges that the Gold Coast was facing at this time was the fact that foreign-owned shops were charging high prices. The British, meanwhile, they thought they would work with the UGCC and draw up a constitution. They saw Kwame Nkrumah as being more of a trouble causer that's not really going to amount to anything. But Nkrumah warned against British constitutional reforms, and he claimed positive action to force the British to grant self-government. And he started to encourage people to go on strikes, demand that the British leave. Don't let them work and create a type of colonial government, or create a type of... For Kwame Nkrumah, the fact that the British wanted to introduce these constitutional reforms was paving the way for neo-colonialism, or they were creating the type of constitution that will allow them to control the Gold Coast after independence. So he launched positive action, and this resulted in strikes beginning on the 8th of January 1950. And as a consequence of this, the Governor General of the Gold Coast, Charles Adrian Clarke, arrested Kwame Nkrumah. And this was actually the perspective of the viewpoint of Kwame Nkrumah. Martin Meredith points out that Kwame Nkrumah at this time was described by the British as being a thoroughgoing communist. And communism at this point in time is the next fascism, because during the lead up to the Second World War, fascism was a big threat. Now it's the Cold War. Communism is seen as a new threat. And Charles Adrian Clarke, in his letter to his family during this period of time when he wasn't writing to them, this is after he arrested Nkrumah, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't have time to write to you. I was dealing with our own local Hitler and his putsch." So he even compared Kwame Nkrumah to Adolf Hitler, and obviously the famous beer hall putsch where Adolf Hitler originally tried to take control of the German government. So that was the way in which they viewed Kwame Nkrumah. But it ended up backfiring on them, because by throwing Kwame Nkrumah in prison, they made him into a hero. And even though Kwame Nkrumah was now arrested, and there was a condition that if you have a term for longer than a year, you were not eligible to stand for elections, Nkrumah was arrested for more than a year, almost 3 years, but it was on 3 separate charges. And he managed to find a loophole that each one of the charges was for less than a year, and he was able to use this to stand for elections. And one of the ironies is that as Kwame Nkrumah went into prison, Kwame Nkrumah, who was another member of his Convention People's Party, was leaving prison that same day. He was arrested for apparently distributing false information or false propaganda in his newspaper. So while Kwame Nkrumah would be in prison, Kwame Nkrumah was going to lead the CPP out of prison. At this time, Joseph Danquah and the UGCC were expecting a very easy election victory, but they were very disorganized. They were only doing election rallies in urban areas, whereas Kwame Nkrumah would travel to rural areas and urban areas. And he would create this image of us, Kwame Nkrumah, almost a mythological figure who has sacrificed, and now he's arrested fighting for the rights of the Ghanaian people. And as I said, throwing Nkrumah in prison made him more and more of a hero. Kwame Nkrumah would have huge signs that say, while Kwame, or huge pictures of Nkrumah, and say, while Nkrumah's body's in prison, his spirit is with us. And apparently Kwame Nkrumah used to write messages on toilet paper, smuggle it out the prison. Supporters would take those to Kwame Nkrumah, and Kwame Nkrumah would stand up before election rallies and read a message from Kwame Nkrumah, who's still in prison. And this was very, very effective. At the end, when the elections were contested, Kwame Nkrumah's party, the CPP, won 34 out of the 38 seats, whereas Joseph Danquah's UGCC only won 3 out of the 38 seats. Kwame Nkrumah got 20,780 votes out of 23,122 votes that were cast. It was an overwhelming majority. Now Adrian Clark, the Governor General of the Gold Coast, is faced with a dilemma. What's he going to do? As far as he was concerned, just not long ago, he was comparing Kwame Nkrumah to Hitler. Kwame Nkrumah was the prisoner. But now the elections have spoken and Kwame Nkrumah has got the overwhelming majority. The British don't really want this Gold Coast experiment to be a disaster. But if they keep Kwame Nkrumah in prison, it's going to be a disaster if the majority of the people are supporting him. So Adrian Clark is faced with a dilemma, and eventually he decides that he's going to meet Kwame Nkrumah, and he informs Kwame Nkrumah that he's going to lead this new government now. And Kwame Nkrumah basically wakes up that morning as a prisoner and goes to bed that night as a prime minister. But he's not exactly a prime minister. It's the 9th of February 1951. Adrian Clark releases Kwame Nkrumah, and the title is called Prime Minister or Minister of Government Business. But in actual fact, at this stage in 1951, the real power still lies in the hands of Adrian Clark and his white officials. But for Nkrumah, it is at least a step in the right direction. His powers are still limited. Adrian Clark is still in charge of the police, the judiciary, finance, defense, and external affairs. And he could also veto any law that Nkrumah's government wanted to pass. In July 1953, Kwame Nkrumah launched a motion demanding full self-government without delay. And he would make that famous saying where he says, "We prefer self-government with danger to servitude in tranquility." During this time, Kwame Nkrumah also began his plans for the future development of Ghana, stressing that power or electricity was crucial to Ghana's future, and he sought to promote the Volta River project. Now, this Volta River project is very complicated. For Kwame Nkrumah, electricity is what he's basing his future plans on Ghana on. Now, it's 1951, he's kind of the leader of the government. The country's not fully independent yet, but he's now planning the economic policies that he's going to pursue when Ghana gets its independence. And one of the tasks he feels is that for his modern, developed Ghana, he wants a self-sufficient, modern, powerful country which is not dependent on imports from overseas. And part of this is this Volta River scheme that the British had started. On the Volta River, there's a lot of bauxite which can be manufactured into aluminium. In the time period now, we're talking about the 1950s, aluminium is like the wonder metal of the future. Lightweight, used for aircraft, a very important resource. And the idea is that if the British would help to build this hydroelectric dam, the river would be able to generate turbines which would generate electricity and manufacture that bauxite into aluminium. But things are going to get a little bit complicated. Kwame Nkrumah's critics warn him that he is going to trap Ghana into foreign debt. The British will not agree to build something for nothing. Nkrumah says he's aware of this. But for Nkrumah, this project has to be built. All his plans about how he's going to modernize Ghana, make it a powerful leader in the African continent, very self-sufficient, depends on this. But his critics say that you're going to have to borrow money from the British, and it's going to be a kind of an example of neo-colonialism. In 1956, events are going to take a dramatic turn, because this is a time in which Gamal Abdel Nasser is going to nationalize the Suez Canal, which is another story for another day. But Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is seen as one of the, like Kwame Nkrumah, liberator of the African continent, he overthrew a foreign monarch in Egypt, and some people say Egypt's true independence began with Gamal Abdel Nasser. And Gamal Abdel Nasser and Kwame Nkrumah were close friends. They had the same kind of ideology. And now Gamal Abdel Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. It makes the British very, very worried about spending a lot of money investing in projects in Africa, where you can have an African leader nationalize that project, and they want to pull out of this Volta River project. And this is a huge disaster for Kwame Nkrumah, because so much of his economic policies depended on this project. Other challenges emerge as well. In 1954, Kwame Nkrumah, who's now Minister of Finance, informed the government that the cocoa prices were going down. So Nkrumah instructed the Cocoa Marketing Board to keep cocoa prices low, to raise funds for development projects. Now, the Cocoa Marketing Board was something that the British devised with the justification that to protect cocoa farmers in Ghana from cocoa price fluctuations, the Marketing Board would control the price. Now that Nkrumah is in charge, he instructs them to keep the price low so they can raise monies for his development projects. Now, his development projects are important to him because he wants to build schools, he wants to build infrastructure, he wants to build factories, etc. But this makes him unpopular for the cocoa farmers because it is depriving them of a lot of profits. In 1954 elections, he fixed a price for a period of 4 years, which were 1/3 of the world's cocoa prices. So this was another problem that's really upsetting the cocoa farmers. In 1954, after elections, Kwame Nkrumah decides to fix the price of cocoa for 4 years, which is 1/3 of the world's cocoa prices. This is really going to upset the cocoa farmers. And they respond, and especially the cocoa farmers, a lot of them are Ashanti, and they have a lot of influence, and they established their own National Liberation Movement, or NLM. And the NLM had a support of chiefs. But in spite of this, Nkrumah still managed to win the next elections, just preceding independence. But this time his support had, the opposition had got a lot stronger in the form of the NLM. And Nkrumah only won 72 out of 104 seats, as opposed to 33 out of 38 that he won in the previous elections. There was also a bomb attack on his life right now, a trend that would continue later on. And he's now going to, focus on some of his industrialization projects. And now, during this period of time, is when the country is going to get its independence. On the 6th of March 1957, Ghana officially celebrates its independence. This was a huge event, globally one of the most important events in African history, the first sub-Saharan African country to get its independence. Delegates from all across Africa and from the rest of the world come to celebrate Ghanaian independence. Kwame Nkrumah is praised, and he delivers his speeches, and he says the liberation of Ghana is meaningless unless it's linked up to the entire liberation of the African continent. Lots of international delegates are present. Martin Luther King is present as well. Just one funny story that Martin Meredith narrates about the Vice President of the United States at this time, Richard Nixon, is that Richard Nixon comes very optimistic, wants to celebrate. He finds himself surrounded by a group of individuals who he thinks are Ghanaian. He puts his hand on one of the individual's shoulders and says, "What's it like to be free?" The person who, unbeknownst to Richard Nixon, was not Ghanaian but African American, turns around and says, "I don't know, I'm from Alabama." Why it's a significant story is because in the United States at this point in time, there's still segregation. The civil rights movement has not yet taken place and has not ended this. So the individual from Alabama is basically telling Richard Nixon, "I'm in your country, but I'm not yet free." But anyway, so the Ghanaian independence is greatly celebrated, and this is going to be very inspirational to many people across the continent. But it's important to take note that while this is happening, there's a lot of challenges that is facing Kwame Nkrumah and his government moving forward. Now, in the rest of this video, I'm not going to go through every detail. In the reference list on this video description, the Martin Meredith chapters are very, very good if you want to really get into this in detail. There's also some other videos that go into this in a lot of detail as well. Instead, I'm just going to deal with some of the overlying problems or some of the generalizations about the task that was ahead of Kwame Nkrumah. Now, again, going back to what was discussed at the beginning of this video, when the African or the former colony gets its independence and becomes an independent nation state, there's so much expectation, but there's also so many challenges. Now, Kwame Nkrumah, his task was to make Ghana into a self-sufficient, modern industrial state. And he had his own concept of scientific socialism. But this is not going to be an easy task, even in a country like Ghana, which is very developed in comparison to other African colonies. It still was a colony designed to supply the metropole with what the metropole requires. So he's got a lot of work ahead. He has plans on free education. He believes in socialism, free hospitals, free this, free that. Building, it's very, very expensive. And his policies, which he believes are going to benefit in the long run, are going to be very, attract a lot of criticisms in the short run. Now, Kwame Nkrumah does, in spite of like today's vantage point, you look at it and you see his leadership as being a complete failure. He did build a lot of schools, hospitals, provided free education, provided free healthcare. Many factories were built during this time. He also established a Black Star shipping line and a Ghanaian airline which trained black pilots. Now, this is quite important because if you think of visitors who come into Ghana now and they see, whoa, there's black pilots. This is a leadership. This is a leading country in Africa, because instead of him, talking all these grand stories about what he's going to do, but then you come in and all the skill tasks are still being done by whites. It was quite inspirational to see a country where blacks were where you were being flown around by black pilots, and it would create quite an impression. He also, he put a major emphasis on training Ghanaians. One of the things he did was the Black Star soccer team, Ghana's official soccer team, used to be coached by whites. So he brought leading Ghanaian football players from overseas to come back to Ghana to be the coaches of this. Another example is he established a huge cattle ranch, a tannery to produce leather, and then a shoe factory, all in the same area. So whereas in the past you would have the cattle hide being exported overseas, converted to leather, sent to another area, being manufactured into shoes, and then sold back into Ghana, he sought to bring the whole manufacturing process in Africa. He wanted to make the country self-sufficient. He invited George Padmore to be advisor of African affairs, the pan-Africanist W.E.B. Du Bois, the other famous pan-Africanist who he made friends with during the Manchester Conference. He invited him to be in charge of Encyclopedia Africana. All this was designed to create this pride that Africans are no longer inferior, but they are leaders, etc. So he had a lot of good intentions, but many ambitious projects were taken during this time, and they had a heavy price. And this is something that his critics warned him. Yes, it's nice to dream, and it's nice to have all these big ambitious projects, but they come with a cost. And they were being more and more worried that Nkrumah is borrowing more and more money, and he's wasting a lot of Ghana's reserves on things that Ghana cannot afford yet. But it was, from the international perspective, foreign businessmen saw Ghana as being an opportunity. If they wanted to launch some ambitious, very expensive project in Ghana, they can get a contract. All they have to do is go to Ghana, bribe one of Kwame Nkrumah's officials, and convince them, instead of building a small hospital, build a huge hospital, whether or not that hospital was actually required. There's many instances of this. And as I say, you can look at the source material for examples. But in an instance where there was only a need for a 2-lane highway, they built a 4-lane highway. A foreign businessman who knew Kwame Nkrumah convinced him that he would need to spend large amounts of monies on concrete silos which would be able to store cocoa and help control the cocoa price. They were built, they were never used because it was totally unnecessary. Instead of having a clinic which would be designed to provide pharmaceutical drugs, they ended up spending one that cost 10 times more, and it was totally unnecessary. Nkrumah wanted to build the largest dry dock in Africa. He spent £5 million on a warship. He also was going to buy his own private 7,500 ton ship. So there was a lot of waste going on. Now, while this was happening, it was becoming more and more difficult to criticize Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah increasingly began to believe the cult of personality. Now, wherever he went, because of his role in leading the first sub-Saharan African country into independence, he was always praised, and he was getting used to this. He would be called things like a Sajafo, which is an Akan word, which means victor in war, but came to be when describing Kwame Nkrumah as redeemer. His face was all over banknotes, postage stamps. There was a statue of him built outside Parliament. And he increasingly came to believe this. And people surrounding him would tell him this. Now, people who were beginning to warn him or beginning to criticize him, hey, Kwame Nkrumah, I don't think it's a good idea spending this much money. It would be very easy to label that person as being an imperialist or a collaborator or a sellout. And this became a norm. Now, Martin Meredith, who I mentioned a lot in this video, and he's one of the authors who you can find in the reference list, he points out and he gives a quotation of an official portrait of Kwame Nkrumah that was distributed during this time. And I'm just going to read this because this gives you an example of what Kwame Nkrumah was constantly hearing about himself, what Ghanaians were constantly being told. To millions of people living both inside and outside the continent of Africa, Kwame Nkrumah is Africa, and Africa is Kwame Nkrumah. When the question was asked, what is going to happen in Africa? It is to one man that everyone looks for the answer, Kwame Nkrumah. To the imperialists and the colonialists, his name is a curse on their lips. To the settler, his name is a warning that the good old days at the expense of the African are coming to an end. To Africans suffering under foreign domination, his name is a breath of hope and means freedom, brotherhood, and racial equality. To us, his people, Kwame Nkrumah is our father, our teacher, our brother, our friend, indeed our very lives. Without him, we would no doubt have existed, but we would not have lived. There would have been no hope for a cure for our sick souls, no taste of glorious victory after a lifetime of suffering. What we owe him is even greater than the air we breathe, for he made us surely as he made Ghana. So when he's constantly hearing things like this, he begins to believe it. Now also it's easy to understand. If you look at his own background, he was born of very, very humble origins. He had a dream. He went overseas, he studied, he came back to Ghana, and he actually made this dream in his lifetime. Not only did he lead his country to independence, but he led the first country in Africa to get its independence by forcing the colonizer out. So he began to really, he believed in something, he was able to achieve it. So now when he believes in the next step, modernizing Africa, uniting Africa, creating a United States of Africa, it's very easy for him to get carried away with this belief that he's going to bring it about. And when he's surrounded by yes men who tell him yes, it's also very easy to then see other people who start to warn him and start to disagree with him and start to say, I don't think this is a good idea, to label those individuals as being sellouts. In 1960, he amended the Constitution so that he could reject decisions of Parliament and dismiss members of the armed forces, public services, and the judiciary. He maintained a total grip over radio, television, and the press. He passed the Preventive Detention Act, which gave him the ability to put someone in prison without trial. And when he tried to pass this in Parliament, 12 ministers tried to block it in 1958. 11 out of those 12 will later find themselves victims of it. There's an instance of, after one of the assassination attempts on his life, the Chief Justice finds the individual not guilty, and Kwame Nkrumah dismisses that Chief of Justice, installs another Chief of Justice who finds them guilty. So Kwame Nkrumah is basically becoming more and more of a dictator. In 1961, there was a drop in cocoa prices, which resulted in tax increases. This resulted in mass protests. Kwame Nkrumah had the protesters arrested, which is kind of ironic because in the beginning of the 1950s, he was the one who was leading protests, and he was the one getting arrested. Now it's the reverse. People are protesting against some of his policies, and he responds by throwing them in prison. And it was very, very difficult for people to disagree with him. Even one of his finance ministers, Kwame Nkrumah, the same individual who led the Convention People's Party to the famous election victory while Kwame Nkrumah was in prison. He disagreed with Kwame Nkrumah about some of Kwame Nkrumah's economic policies, and Kwame Nkrumah responded by basically trying to arrest Kwame Nkrumah, who then had to leave Ghana and go into exile to escape being prosecuted. So he became more and more dictatorial. But also, it's just important to understand that there were so many different assassination attempts that were made on his life. So if you do see it from Kwame Nkrumah's perspective, yes, there was a lot of corruption, and many members in his parliament found out that, if you do as Kwame Nkrumah wants and you say what he wants to hear, you can live a very nice life taking bribes from foreign companies they'll give you a bribe, you'll end up pursuing an extremely unnecessary, expensive project with that company, so you have a good life. And those who try to criticize him, they get punished very, very badly. But from Kwame Nkrumah's perspective, he believes that this is the way to go. He believes that the scientific socialism is the solution to Ghana's ails. It's the way of bringing about modernity, development, making Africans proud. This is what's required. This is what he believes. And there's so many assassination attempts on his life, which is part of the reason that he would justify why he becomes more and more dictatorial. There's a time where he's walking home, a police officer tries to shoot him. There's another incident where the assassins give a girl a bouquet of flowers to present to Kwame Nkrumah. It blows up. It doesn't kill him. There's a bomb in that bouquet of flowers. It kills the girl and it injures Kwame Nkrumah. So there's so many different assassination attempts on his life. He becomes more and more distrustful and more reclusive. Now, one of the criticisms that Kwame Nkrumah gets a lot is that what he's doing is not democratic. But then his counter argument would be, democracy is not going to work in Africa. It's not these concepts that people saying, no, this is how you should do it. You should have multiple parties. And he can disagree with that. And he said, for a developed country like the United Kingdom or the United States, it's nice and easy for them to talk. But for a country like Africa, for an African country which has so much to do, if you have one person say we should do this and another person say we should do that, nothing's going to get achieved. You need a one-party state. You need to think long-term. You can't have a party now, they pursue these policies, the policies result in taxes being raised, and then they lose the next election, the new government comes to power, they reverse it, nothing's going to be achieved. So he has very good reasons for why he doesn't want to believe in democracy. But the problem is, he's only hearing what he wants to hear, and anyone who tells him any criticism, you're spending too much money, you're draining the reserves, it's not good, that person has to flee, go to exile, or that person gets arrested. And he put a lot of people in prison. He used the Preventive Detention Act to put a lot of people in life imprisonment. But the situation ends up being that during independence, Ghana was one of the richest countries in the third world. From all the colonies that get their independence, Ghana was one of the wealthiest. But by 1965, it was bankrupt, and there was no money to pay for the industrialization projects. The deputy governor of Ghana Central Bank took a very courageous decision, because people would not be this confident to tell Nkrumah this, but he wrote a letter to Kwame Nkrumah to tell him that their reserves were only 500,000 pounds. And Kwame Nkrumah responds and says, I think you made a mistake. You left out a couple of zeros. Must be at least 50 million, can't be 500,000. And that individual had to tell Nkrumah, no, Ansah had to tell Nkrumah, no, I'm telling you, this is not a typing error. This is all that's left. Nkrumah got a number of officials together, and he asked them one by one, is this true? And each one had to confirm, because he was so distrustful of everyone. And then eventually, when the news reached him, it said that he went into 15 minutes of silence and then wept. But at that stage, he just had to keep moving ahead with the next project. Just again, this Volta River project, the Okasomo Dam that he wanted to build, that was crucial even before Ghana got its independence, when he was still Minister of Government Business in 1951. This plan was part of his vision for the future Ghana, because the hydroelectric dam would generate electricity, it would convert bauxite into aluminium, and it would create a profit. But Britain pulled out of the project in 1956 when Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Fortunately for Nkrumah, during the Independence Day celebration, met a lot of Americans, and Komla Gaberema traveled to the United States shortly thereafter. This was obviously before he had to go into exile. But when he went to the United States of America, went to meet the United States President Eisenhower, there is a story that he narrates where he wanted to stop off at a restaurant and gets drink some juice, but it happened to be in the south, and Africans were not allowed to purchase or to eat at that restaurant, and he was declined. And this was like very source of great anger for Kwame Nkrumah as the anyway, the significance of that visit was that Kwame Nkrumah was put into contact with someone who could help Kwame Nkrumah with the Volta River project, the Okasomo Dam, and that was Edgar Kaiser, who was involved in aluminium. But this is just the instance again about this whole concept of neocolonialism. Now, Kwame Nkrumah is warning about this concept neocolonialism, where he says foreign companies will loan African leaders money, but they will control it. And he says that the United States is going to be the next colonizer. So he writes a book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, which vilifies the United States of America. But this is things that his critics in Ghana have been warning him about a long time ago. This project is dangerous because you're going to have to get foreign help, and they don't give you things without conditions. And what eventually happened with this Volta River project is that the United States and Edgar Kaiser, agreed to build the project, but under one condition, and that condition is that they import bauxite to convert to aluminium, and they don't use Ghanaian bauxite. Now, the argument is that Ghanaian bauxite is not of a high quality, and it's going to be it's going to cause complications with the project. But another important factor is that it gives them control, because by doing something like that, they can prevent a leader in like Kwame Nkrumah from nationalizing this project. So they introduce it, but they come with their own conditions. And Kwame Nkrumah, it's either get the project built or don't get the project built. And for him, it's more important to get the project built, because so much of his plans for developing Ghana depends on that project. But again, this is just this whole dilemma that will constantly face him. On one hand, he's borrowing money, he's putting Ghana in more and more debt to build this, to build that, because he thinks this is what's necessary for the type of Ghanaian society, for the type of self-sufficient country that he wants. But at the same time, he's criticizing the West and speaking about neocolonialism. But his critics who warn him that he's the one that's enabling this to happen in Ghana are the ones that he's going to throw in prison, or will have to go into exile to escape being thrown into prison. Kwame Nkrumah is having all of these problems, and while all Ghana is facing all these economic problems, he still sees himself as the liberator of the African continent. He wants to create an organization of African unity, a United States of Africa, but he also increasingly frustrates other African leaders. When other African leaders want to establish a federation, like Julius Nyerere and other East African leaders want to establish an East African federation, Nkrumah criticizes them and he tells them no. But what gives him the right to tell them no? He wants to create a United States of Africa, make himself the leader. Other African leaders say, no, what gives you the right to tell us what to do? And there's also instances of him having fallouts with like the president of Togo and Niger, and Ghanaians are involved in an assassination attempt on the president of Togo and later in Niger. And this also makes other African leaders start boycotting some of Kwame Nkrumah's various conferences he has to unite the continent. And it's also a very famous incident at one conference where Julius Nyerere will embarrass Kwame Nkrumah by out-arguing him. And Kwame Nkrumah, so he's want to be this whole leader of the United States of Africa, and the other African leaders he alienates himself with them. One African leader he doesn't alienate himself with is Secretary of Guinea. But when Secretary of Guinea declared independence from France, France really punished Guinea, and they pulled out and they took a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the facilities that they built, and they put Secretary in a very bad predicament. And Secretary needed money, and Kwame Nkrumah lent him an enormous sum of money. But then Ghana doesn't have that money. So again, it makes Kwame Nkrumah increasingly unpopular back at home. And eventually in 1966, when Kwame Nkrumah, still seen as a very important international figure, he will travel to Vietnam, to Hanoi, invited by Ho Chi Minh to help intervene in the Vietnam War that's taking place. But before he gets to Vietnam, he stops up in China. And when he arrives in China, they ask him if he's heard the bad news, and he's unaware of what bad news. They tell him while he was on the plane, there was a military coup d'etat back at home, and he's been overthrown. And no one in Ghana really resisted, because at this stage he had become so unpopular. And what happens is they try and completely tarnish the image of Kwame Nkrumah. They destroy the statue. They get a bunch of young children to come and stand on the statue and just basically disgrace Nkrumah furthermore. Okay, so after the military coup, Kwame Nkrumah will spend the rest of his life in Guinea. Ahmed Sékou Touré allows Nkrumah to stay in Guinea, and Nkrumah will use the last years of his life to write various books. He passes away in 1972, and there are theories that he did not die of natural causes, but he might have been poisoned. There are also theories about the extent of CIA involvement in the military coup that overthrew Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. But just the way of thinking about this Kwame Nkrumah topic and how it fits into the experience of very many other African countries after they got their independence, there is a common theme. You have an African nationalist leader who emerges as a heroic figure who leads his people to independence. And once they come to independence, they become increasingly dictatorial. They create a one-party state, and then that one-party state cannot be challenged democratically. So the military overthrows it, and the military comes to power, puts in a new civilian government. The new civilian government faces the same problems, and they get overthrown again by the military, and the cycle continues. And that's what happened in Ghana. After Nkrumah was overthrown, the military took over, had the power to civilian government. They faced the exact same problems Nkrumah did. They did the exact same things. They were overthrown. And you got the cycle continuing. But why? And it's easy to judge leaders today as being dictators, but the task that they had was a very difficult task. And when Nkrumah came to power in Ghana, he had a lot of dreams, a lot of ideas about what he was going to do, how he was going to lead Ghana, how he was going to lead Africa. But there were so many challenges and obstacles in his way. It was by no means an easy task. And another important factor to take note of is that this period was characterized by the Cold War, an extremely hostile international environment. And every decision that African leaders made, they were underdeveloped during the colonial period, and their decisions were greatly influenced by the more powerful countries at this point in time. And the more powerful countries were concerned with this bipolar rivalry between the two superpowers. So looking at the story about the rise and fall of Kwame Nkrumah, it is important to be aware that the predicament of moving from colonialism to independence was difficult on its own. But with the type of hostile international environment, it was even more difficult.